Good morning, or good afternoon, and thank you for joining today. My name is Daniel Mitchell, and I'm the Marine Manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, and I'll be hosting you today for this online event. How can we develop offshore wind at the speed and scale required to tackle the climate crisis, and at the same time return our seas to a healthy, thriving, and resilient state? This is the central question of our documentary, Winds of Change, and which we'll be exploring in this event today. It's also a question that BirdLife, as well as many other organizations from industry, national authorities, NGOs, researchers, is working hard to find answers to. The documentary that you'll see shortly was produced by Big Wave Productions in association with Tiger Vision for a partnership with BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, and with the support of the Renewables Grid Initiative, the North Sea Foundation, and Natura Milieu. After the screening, we will have a question and answer session with representatives from two offshore wind developers, Ørsted and Iberdrola. So please, if you have any questions, you can use the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer as many of these as possible later in the program. Now, we have a small change to the schedule. Ariel Brunner, BirdLife Europe's director, who was meant to be with us, has had a late change to his schedule and is currently in a meeting related to the European Commission's strategic dialogue on the future of EU agriculture. So to kick off in his place, I'm pleased to welcome BirdLife Europe's policy manager, Anouk Puy-Martin, who's going to give us a short introduction. Over to you, Anouk.
Thanks, Daniel, and welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for making the time to join us today. So my name is Anouk Puy-Martin. I'm the policy manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia, and I know you are eager to see the film, so I will be as brief as possible. I just wanted to take a few minutes to get back to the reason why actually we started this project. As you all know, climate change is unquestionably the greatest threat the world has ever faced. All our efforts should be focused today on tackling the climate crisis, and this requires, among others, the rapid decarbonization of our electricity. A fast transition to renewable energy is absolutely necessary to avoid locking in more carbon in our atmosphere. But there is also an urgent need to recognize the interdependence between climate change and biodiversity loss. Climate action critically depends on healthy and resilient natural ecosystems. To fight against the climate change, we need nature. There is no other way. Offshore wind, and we will see in the documentary, has a key role to play in the transition to renewable energy. But the planned scale of offshore wind development will inevitably put additional pressure on our already very busy seas, because our marine environment has been significantly damaged since centuries because of human. Europe's seas suffer from years of overexploitation and neglect, risking a point of no return for our marine ecosystem. Yet, we also know healthy oceans are a key ally in the fight against climate change. Ocean acts as a vital carbon sink, regulates weather patterns, provides oxygen, so we all depend on it. Therefore, the expansion of offshore wind needs to be done in the right way. Ensuring wind farms are located in the right place and that measures are taken to mitigate any impacts on nature. Some solutions are already there, ready to be implemented by developers and decision makers, and we will see that in the documentary. But what we need above all is to bring back nature on a larger scale, to ensure that, as actually the EU was committed to do, 30% of our sea are reserved for nature, and that a third of it is actually free from any human activity. We need to work with industry to exploit every opportunity to restore nature, inside wind farms, but most importantly, beyond wind farms, and to look at the health of the sea in a holistic way. This week, I'm very happy to say that we are celebrating the adoption of the EU Nature Restoration Law. I'm sure you've all heard about it, about the law and its political twists and turns. And you might know that it's a groundbreaking initiative to bring back nature to the continent and to set a clear direction for member states to restore degraded and valuable biodiversity. It's also a unique opportunity to ensure coherence between all EU and global commitments on climate and biodiversity, and to finally start reversing the trend towards collapse of biodiversity. Because this is the only way, that's only by tackling those challenges together, nature restoration and renewables expansion, hand in hand and in a coordinated and strategic way, that we can achieve what we are calling a nature-positive renewable energy transition. So we really need a whole hand on deck now to ensure that this law can be a game changer, the game changer that it aims to be. This is why we need to work all together, industry, scientists, civil society. And in recent years, the wind industry and environmental organizations such as BirdLife, but also our partners that Daniel mentioned, have been joining forces to contribute to the energy transition while taking care of our nature. The Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, the Ocean Coalition, is proof that this can work. And this is actually what this documentary is all about, to show that collaboration is essential and that concrete solutions for climate neutral and nature positive future depend on this. This documentary is about the energy transition in our ocean. It's about the treasures of our seas. It's also about people working together for a better future. It was already a big success when it was screened at the Wind Europe conference in Bilbao in March, and we are really delighted today to bring you this online premiere. So thank you very much now, and I hope you will enjoy the film.
Climate change is perhaps the biggest challenge facing our lives today. The natural world that supports us in so many ways is in peril, and there is an urgent need for us to do all we can to reverse its decline. The transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy is key to this, and harnessing the power of wind to generate that energy is an essential part of our solution. The North Sea, with its strong and reliable winds and shallow waters, offers the perfect conditions for the expansion of offshore wind power. But the North Sea brings us so much more.
The North Sea is home for lots of nature. You have incredible diversity of wildlife that you find in the North Sea, from seabirds to marine mammals to fish to invertebrate species.
The North Sea is not just a bowl of water, but it's full of life. It's very interesting. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to protect and a lot to be happy about.
Well, the North Sea is really it's an amazing place with all the sort of seabird colonies on there, incredibly rich, incredibly vibrant. You have all those noise, those sort of smells, and really you can't experience them anywhere else around the UK and around Europe.
The North Sea is a unique marine environment, alive with biodiversity. It provides a range of different habitats, from shallow bays to deep fjords, sandbanks and rocky shores that support rich marine ecosystems, home to an abundance of fish, shellfish and marine mammals. More than 30 different seabird species inhabit its coasts and cliffs, feeding on the riches that its waters provide. And like all seas, it's fundamental to our lives too. It gives us food, supports economic activities, and its coasts and beaches are spaces for us to enjoy in so many different ways. But the North Sea has been heavily overexploited. Overfishing has been a problem for more than 100 years, and still continues. And human activities from oil and gas to aquaculture and shipping all compete for space in what is one of the busiest seas on the planet. And this has already taken its toll on nature.
So the North Sea has always been a very important part of society, going back thousands of years. And yeah, we've really made a lot of money from the sea, and we're now reaching a point where we're taking too much from the sea. We're asking too much of the sea, and it's starting to become a problem for the wildlife that is out there.
Yeah, unfortunately the North Sea is already a pretty degraded ecosystem because of all the different human activities happening there. And the trend isn't really reversing itself. We see many different species in decline, and the North Sea can't cope with all these pressures anymore.
And healthy marine ecosystems don't just support biodiversity. They are also a key ally in the fight against climate change. as they capture and lock away carbon. But as our seas degrade, their ability to continue to provide this vital service also diminishes. So it is crucial that as we build and operate our renewable energy systems to address the climate crisis, that we also consider carefully the impact of those activities on the natural world that we are, in fact, trying to protect.
There is definitely a need for offshore wind expansion in the North Sea, across the UK, across Europe. We need to reach net zero by 2050, by 2045 really, if we are to stand a chance to sort of minimize the impact of the climate crisis. However, we can't get this wrong. We need the offshore wind to be thought out so it's put in places that will impact nature in the least way possible.
We absolutely need to press ahead with tackling climate change and cleaning up our power systems, not only from a carbon and climate perspective, but also for energy security. We've just got to make sure we do it right, and we do it in a way that provides the right response to the biodiversity crisis as well as climate.
And that is the challenge. There are significant plans for the expansion of offshore wind in the North Sea to meet these climate goals. Capacity is set to more than triple between 2023 and 2030 and increase tenfold by 2050.
There is risks with this expansion if it's not planned properly. There is risks typically for our seabirds, the most obvious risk being of course collision, which is the one that we probably speak about the most. But there's also a lot of other sort of less direct impacts that can be caused. So typically by placing wind farms in between their routes from nesting to feeding, which means that they would have to increase their feeding rounds, leaving the chicks at the nest for longer than expected and increasing potentially the risks of mortality here.
And it's not just the impact of the turbines themselves that needs to be considered. There is significant infrastructure needed to connect these systems to our electricity grid.
A grid connects the renewable generation to industry and consumers. Therefore, if we think about the infrastructure, we need to think also about subsea cables, converter stations, landing point, because renewables and grid needs to be considered together. They are both part of the same solution.
Whether it is the location of the turbines or the infrastructure to support them, selecting the most suitable place to build an offshore wind farm is critical to avoid conflict with nature, or at least minimize it.
So this really comes down to spatial planning of your offshore wind. So the best way to minimize harm to nature from offshore wind is to avoid impacts in the first place. And this means placing your wind farms in the best possible locations at sea, which means avoiding those areas that are really important for nature, that contain species and habitats that are sensitive to negative impacts, and locating your wind farms in areas where the negative impacts will be less.
The process for selecting a location varies country by country, but ultimately, decisions are taken by the nation-state. So there is a huge responsibility on the shoulders of governments to get this right. But regardless of where a wind farm is built, some impact on nature may be unavoidable. That's why avoidance is just the first step in what ecologists call the mitigation hierarchy.
The mitigation hierarchy starts on the one hand with avoidance. So for example, if I want to make an offshore wind farm, if I want to put it somewhere in the marine area, I'm going to find a place that has the least effects on nature. And then the next step, if I'm going to build my wind farm there, is to mitigate effects. So for example, I'm going to pile drive my turbines into the seafloor, which makes noise. But maybe I can lower that noise a little bit by placing bubble curtains. So we're mitigating the effect. But there's still an effect. And what you want to do then is look beyond mitigation towards compensation and restoration.
It's the statutory bodies, the national bodies that decide the areas, and increasingly they're also deciding the very specific footprint of each individual wind farm. Once we have a site, we have a lot that we can do in terms of following the mitigation hierarchy in a way that delivers minimum impacts and addresses the impacts that remain.
There are many mitigation measures wind farm operators can put in place to reduce their impact on the environment. And that starts at the design stage. This may include changes to the layout of the turbines or changes to their height or configuration. And then comes the construction phase, and that in itself is a massive maritime operation with fairly well-known effects on the seabed and the creatures that live around it.
In the construction phase, noise is probably the main challenge here. Noise comes mainly from drilling and hammering operations in the seabed, but it could also come as well by the amount of vessels that would come and go to the site. We have to reduce the impacts by selecting the best time of the year to perform the operations where there's less animals in the area, but also we deliver improved processes like a soft start in the drilling operations that will allow the animals to leave the area before the noise increases. But also in very sensitive areas, we deliver physical noise reduction features like bubble curtains.
So bubble curtain essentially creates, if you like, a donut around where we're installing the foundation, and it releases a string of air bubbles around that donut, and it creates a curtain of air bubbles which provide acoustic damping, so the noise that's created while we're putting in the foundation is somewhat reduced for anything that's outside that bubble curtain.
Once the wind farm is up and running, the impacts of the construction phase may be over, but there are continuing effects throughout the lifetime of its operation.
Those wind farms are incredibly significant. They're big. They are the size of the Eiffel Tower. So you can imagine that something this size is going to cause some disturbance when it's being created, but also throughout its life cycle.
Modern offshore wind turbines are indeed giants. The largest can reach more than 250 meters in height, with blade spans exceeding 200 meters, and can generate enough electricity to power over 10,000 homes. Some wind farms contain more than 100 turbines and cover areas of more than 100 square kilometers. That's about the size of 10,000 football pitches.
We're talking about the operation phase of a wind farm here. The most challenging aspect would be birds. And for this, probably the most critical stage would be the design phase of the wind farm. The selection of sites and also the selection, for example, of the height of the wind turbines. We need to bring along more technological innovations to detect and prevent birds from colliding with the wind turbines. Here, a good example, a promising technology would be the use of radar together with cameras to provide an early detection of incoming birds and deliver the appropriate operating instructions.
In some cases, despite careful siting and mitigation of adverse effects on the natural environment, impacts may remain. And this leads to the final stage in the mitigation hierarchy, the idea of compensation.
So the idea of compensation is that you're trying to compensate for something that you've done that you have not been able to mitigate effectively. So it's seen as the end of the hierarchy. And there are examples now. I mean, there's a good one at the moment where the seabird, the kittiwake, is very much vulnerable in terms of its breeding environment. So they've actually put, for want of a better word, 2 kittiwake hotels where they've created these opportunities for the kittiwakes to go and nest. That's not at the wind farm site, but it's a kind of an example of a compensation. What we need to do though is determine, is it effective? Does it work? What's the potential outcome of that?
Because of the scale of offshore wind development, there is still going to be a need to have some of this compensation in some cases, and we do recognize that. So we're working really hard with government and with our scientists and with other organizations to try and find solutions that could work. We really want to be enablers in this space here. But recognizing that the key is always going to be to avoid and to mitigate for impact in the first place.
Avoidance, mitigation, and compensation. We have to protect our seas and the creatures that live in them as we go through this transformation. They are already in a critical state. And that's why this may be an opportunity to do more than just limit the damage we do. This is an opportunity to go a step further, to take positive action to recover nature.
Within wind farms, we can also do stuff that's positive for nature, and this is referred to as nature-inclusive design. So we can look at making these sites more attractive for some types of nature. So we can do stuff like artificial reefs within the wind farm sites. We can modify the turbines to provide spaces for fish and other invertebrates. It's really all about finding ways that we can make these sites more attractive for nature.
We as a nature organization are working a lot with the wind industry because we have the same goal. But if you want to become nature positive, you need to also include nature inclusive design. And that should be your focus when you're developing a wind farm. You're including nature into your design.
This cooperation between environmental organizations and industry is happening. The Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, nicely abbreviated to OCEAN, is a coalition of more than 30 NGOs, wind and grid actors across Europe, working together to speed up the rollout of offshore wind, while, at the same time, protecting nature and restoring our seas. And there are also national initiatives, such as the Rich North Sea programme in the Netherlands.
So with the program we also do active restoration or active nature enhancement, where we try to kickstart nature a little bit to push it in the right direction. So for example, in the south of the Netherlands we have the Borssele wind farm area where we have two projects. One is focused on oysters, so flat oyster or native oyster, and we place them on the scour protection of wind farms. And then we go back and check on them and see how they're doing, but it's more than just oysters because they also provide habitat for other species.
The humble oyster is a carbon-absorbing, habitat-creating organism. The oyster is not a single species, it's a species that attracts 400 plus other species to its reefs. It is the ultimate ecosystem engineer.
But action within wind farms has its limits. Some species cannot thrive in wind farms, whatever we do there, and may, in any case, actively avoid these areas. And of course, there is a need to support nature recovery across the whole North Sea, not just within wind farms.
I think the data is coming together very quickly on where to put what, where you put an artificial reef to put in cod or lobster, where the most fertile place to put back oysters might be. I think that's coming together, and it needs to be a three-way thing between government, wind farm operators and the ecologists themselves.
It's also looking where we can have the biggest impact on the broader ecosystem where we're operating, and a good example of this is in the Humber estuary, where we've got a rewilding restoration program running that includes putting in 500,000 native oysters. We're also planting seagrass, really important for a number of reasons. It's great for habitat creation, it has high ecosystem services, as we would say, but it also sequesters carbon, something like 4 times as efficiently as terrestrial forest, by the way. And we're also restoring salt marsh. So a really broad program of restoration. We're doing that to learn how we can best deliver this net positive biodiversity impact.
We need to restore back ecosystems that have been degraded over many, many years of unsustainable development. It's our time to go beyond just protection and getting to restoration of nature.
The renewable energy transition marks a new era for our seas and an opportunity to rethink how we use them. We can develop the renewable energy resources we need to tackle the climate crisis and have healthy, thriving seas. But this will require all users, not just the wind sector, to play their part.
One of the bigger problems that we have is that we don't really know what the impact is on the ecology by the different sectors. So we do know that we're going to put even more pressure on this already fragile ecosystem. So we need to have this holistic view, and not just as separate countries, but as North Sea countries together, and to make a proper marine spatial plan that works, because ecology does not know boundaries.
The way forward will require smart solutions, creating spaces that can be shared by different users, whilst also ensuring a reduction of the overall pressure on our seas. Some areas should remain free from all human activities and disturbance to enable nature to recover and thrive. The transition to renewable energy is a wake-up call. It is a challenge for nature, but it's also an opportunity that we simply can't afford to miss. The price of getting it wrong is high, but the rewards of getting it right, for nature and for us, are immeasurable.
Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the documentary. I hope it provided some inspiration. And in particular, I hope that it sparked some questions, because we are now going to move to a Q&A session. So if you have questions, please use the button at the bottom and enter them. I'm delighted that we have with us for this Q&A session, Rennie Myers, who's the Global Ocean Policy Lead at Ørsted, and Emilio Tejedor, who's Head of Environment at Iberdrola. So welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us today. I would like to kick things off with a question for you, Rennie, if I may. So Ørsted recently launched a biodiversity measurement framework. So can you say a few words about this framework and how you feel it will help to move us forward on this topic of renewable energy and nature?
Absolutely. So thank you again for having me. It's a real pleasure to speak and to have been able to contribute as Ørsted to the documentary, which I think does a great job of laying out everything that's at stake and the different steps that we're taking as an industry and as a broader conservation community to make sure that we can make this transition in the right way. And so to do that, we need to not just take action, which my colleague Benj speaks about in the video. One of our restoration projects amongst a suite of pilot projects is the Humber Estuary Restoration Project. But we also need to be able to manage what the impact of those projects actually are. Now, we've been doing monitoring throughout our development as an industry, throughout the siting process through construction to operation. There are already requirements and voluntary actions that industry takes to monitor and measure our impact over time. But when it comes to those restoration projects and how they contribute to broader ecosystems change, how they contribute to ecosystem health, and how we can, down to the species level and population level, understand what the interaction between a given project and population in a positive way might be, we realized that as a company, we needed a more holistic tool to be able to integrate into our decision-making processes, so that early on in project design, we're thinking not just about how we're going to design an offshore wind farm, maybe what nature restoration projects we might be taking, but also how we're going to comprehensively monitor and measure for that over time. So yes, last week we released our monitoring and measurement framework for the biodiversity program, which will be implemented globally for all of our projects that are commissioned after 2030, for which we have a net positive ambition. So happy to speak more about the details of that, but we're really glad that we have a tool that we can use to guide internal decision making, in addition to many of our other biodiversity policies that we have in place as we develop new projects, because we don't have time to waste, and we want to make sure that this is something that we integrate into the base case and product value that we propose as an industry.
Thank you, Rennie. And passing to you, Emilio, I mean, can you say something about what Iberdrola does to measure its impacts, both negative but also positive impacts of the steps that it takes on nature and biodiversity?
Yeah, sure, Daniel, and thank you for having me in this panel, and congratulations on the documentaries. Very impressive. Well, yeah, Iberdrola launched its biodiversity plan, 2030 biodiversity plan, like a couple of years ago, and with the main goal to become positive on biodiversity by 2030. That will cover all of our activities, the operating assets, but also all the construction activities, with the main target of at least becoming neutral on biodiversity, but that's in each site. But it's a global, each business line will have to be positive on biodiversity altogether. So that is that launched an activity line similar to the one that Ørsted has developed, which is how can we measure, how can we quantify our impacts on biodiversity? And this is a really challenging task. It was mentioned in the documentary as well, how difficult it is to quantify the positive actions, but it comes, I think, it brings along something the whole sector is in, and specifically the offshore sector as well, that is collaboration with research institutions and with NGOs and with governments to try to bring together all the different approaches, different solutions and projects to see how can we, after the process of the mitigation hierarchy, how can we get to the compensation actions that and deliver actions that really provide value, that really provide the outcomes that we really that we are looking for. So yeah, within this scope of this biodiversity plan and its goals, where we are developing the accounting framework for biodiversity and all the actions to restore nature in all our projects.
Thank you, Emilio. Now, passing to a question from one of our audience members, and this is about cumulative impacts, specifically thinking about birds, migratory birds that are traveling a long distance and probably encounter on that route numerous offshore wind farms. I mean, how do you incorporate these cumulative impacts into these measurements that you do?
So I can,
Sure.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Amelia.
No, I mean, this is part of the research and the developments that we need to do to understand how species are coping with impacts throughout their activity. I mean, migrating birds are really challenging because their impacts will come not only from possible wind farms they encounter in their route, but many other impacts in the different countries or areas where we are passing through, and trying to correlate impacts on, for example, species count, and I mean, it's challenging, but that comes from cooperation, from sharing data with administrations, with governments, and there are international groups that are being created to try to have a holistic understanding of how these species are behaving and the root causes of their decline or thriving, if that's the case, to tackle them. And yeah, wind farms are a possible source of impact, but we need to have a look at what's happening to that particular species that we might be interested in the whole areas of impact. But the collaboration, the new environmental impact assessments are coming with specific chapters for cumulative impact as well, but they're hard to evaluate. But again, collaboration and investigation and knowledge sharing.
And I'll just I'll chip in there. I think my video might have booted out, but just to say that that it's key that it's incorporated into the environmental impact statement, but it can also inform the additional actions that we take. So if we're looking at a population level impact, maybe the right thing to do isn't on site, as was noted for the kittiwake example in the documentary, but looking across the sort of life cycle and of the population and where they're making their touch points as they transit from maybe one side of the Baltic Sea to the other, for example.
Thank you, Renee. And yeah, I appreciate this is a very, very challenging issue. I'm going to come in with a kind of big question to both of you now. I mean, one of the main messages from the documentary, and Emilio just referenced to it, is the fact that, you know, this offshore wind development is happening in seas that are already very busy. There's already a myriad of other human activities that are happening, and there are cumulative impacts that result from all of these activities. But obviously addressing all of these will be essential if we want to achieve healthy seas alongside the renewable energy generation that's needed. I would just like to hear from you, what do you think the role is that the offshore wind industry can play in kind of helping to tackle these wider challenges with the marine environment? Obviously, the wind industry cannot deal with all the challenges alone, but I'm just, looking for how you think they can contribute to making progress on these challenging issues. And Emilio, I'll pass to you first.
I'll start if I may. It's a similar response to what I said earlier. I mean, we need to understand properly how the ecosystem is behaving and the different impacts it's facing. And wind farms are developments that we have to consider their impacts, but we have to also understand properly the opportunities for delivering positive outcomes for these ecosystems. And if we are able to understand where those impacts for the ecosystems are coming, and maybe wind farms might tackle some of those impacts and deliver positive responses for it, and maybe then mitigate and compensate the negative residual negative impacts that are there. But there are I mean, the science is coming, and it was also mentioned in the documentary, data is coming, because one of the things that these massive developments that we are doing, not only in offshore, but also in onshore, is that we are providing, companies are providing tons of data on how nature and how species are behaving, tons of data that are all coming together. New technologies are there to be able to manage this data and understand and extract information. So all of that is coming together. The situations might be terrible, but I think we are progressing at a fantastic pace, and new projects are coming with improved measures and more sound designs. And these are really long lead time projects as well. So we have to understand that when we place the first piece of a wind farm has been years of development and design. So maybe the last bit of development is not just there; it will be in the next one. But without minimizing the situation, but I think the whole energy sector and especially the offshore wind sector is really aggressive in protecting nature and understanding it and providing a lot of resources. Sorry if that was too long.
No. And I just to tack on there, I think as an industry, we can work collectively across the offshore wind industry, but we can also look across those sectors. So maybe there are technologies that we can share for vessel decarbonization, for noise mitigation for vessels, for spatial awareness offshore, that are developed because of the specific questions that we're trying to address as the offshore wind industry and the high bar that's being set by regulators, but that can then be transferred over to other sectors. So I think that's one key piece for me. I think the data piece is an excellent point to make. Marine spatial planning is a key tool that we have to make sure that we're deconflicting as much as possible, not just conflicts between nature and development for offshore renewable energy, but also between the maritime sectors. And so if you look at a spatial map for the North Sea, it is, it's hard to find a space that's still available for any additional activity, whether or not that's conservation, sustainable development, or transit for the maritime sector. And so it means that we have to have those data to be able to plug in and say, what can we make of the space that we have through multi-use, through co-locating aquaculture, through making sure that we've got the right types of maritime safety laws in place and those shared technologies so that we're all trying to reach the same threshold and standard for environmental mitigation and protection across industries. So I think it's a great question, Daniel.
Thanks, Rennie, and completely agree on your point about marine spatial planning. I mean, I think it's a key tool, particularly when you think of somewhere as packed with activity as the North Sea. I'm going to pick up on the data issue because there's a question from one of the audience, and it's about the kind of strong push from the European Commission to member states to make data accessible, to collate it in portals. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, I mean, what are the key steps that we need to kind of reach this vision of having all of this data that's being generated by the offshore wind industry and potentially other sectors in these accessible portals?
Absolutely. I can take the first stab at this one. First of all, I'd recommend the work of the Corporate Data Group, which is run by the IOC and UNESCO and is currently advocating for a set of exactly these sorts of principles, one of which is maybe a shared data platform and format that people can use to request those data. But there's also some collective questions that we have, like around cumulative impacts, that can guide exactly what data we need to prioritize. There is a ton out there. There's also some great public data that we want to make sure matches and syncs up so that we have the most robust analysis possible. So there's specific species impacts and concerns, but then there's those broader data sets where maybe it can answer some questions about ocean biogeochemistry that are already maybe being covered by the public sector and by governments. So where can private sector, how do we prioritize what the private sector has available to make sure that we get those data out the door in the right way to those platforms? And then we can work through maybe the second tier sorts of issues. And those need to be assessed collectively across the private sector, academia, civil society, and governments.
Thanks, Rennie. Anything to add here, Emilia?
Well, I think she made good points. I think standardization of data is fantastic. That's a really challenging task as well. Everything is very challenging here, but I mean, at least not having the best solution shouldn't avoid us for having a partially good solution. So let's start trying to standardize how we want to collect data and then put it all together in this platform. That will enable researchers and institutions dealing with environmental impact assessments, academia, everybody. So we need to start that way. I was saying earlier that we are producing tons of data there were already many tons of data from many years that have been stored in drawers in the different governments. And because of this, because data is not structured, it's not well captured, and it's now probably an impossible task to recover and use, but at least the new data sets that we are producing we should move forward to this platform, I would say, so that is shared.
And I'll add, I think one thing that would make that even more possible is if we think about that as part of the base case of an offshore wind project, which means it needs to be incorporated in the product that's being procured. And if you look at one of the most recent tenders in the Netherlands, they actually had a specific call out for data management and making sure that you have the appropriate resources for data management, sharing, interaction, and engagement with academia to get the most out of the data that we're going to be collected as possible. And so that's one model and one approach that we can take to making sure that it's sort of fundamentally resourced in a product, as opposed to sort of saying there's a government platform that then you need to sort of scramble around to find resources to be able to contribute to, sort of more ad hoc, to Amelia's point.
Thanks. And yeah, that's a very interesting point, how you link this to then your tender criteria from the start. So very interesting. A question from one of the audience, and this is for Emilio. Someone picked up that you mentioned in the documentary about offshore radars. And their question is, and I don't know how much of an expert you are on the technical details of these, but how these are configured to interact with or inform the curtailment of turbines.
This is technology we are developing. There are some technologies around detecting incoming birds and identifying the possible routes of the bird and estimate possible collisions. We are testing many of those onshore first, and once we have them ready, we haven't installed them yet on offshore wind farms because it's pretty much developing activities. But we are doing some. I mentioned in the video, we are doing a project where we combine radar with cameras. So because some systems only have cameras, others might have only radars, but the beauty of having a radar is that you identify the flying objects no matter the visual conditions. And you have to imagine that the bird can be a few kilometers away from the camera. So sometimes the camera can be sweeping space and not see it but you have the radar, you locate the flying bird, and then you tell the cameras to point that situation, then you see the bird. Then intelligence comes in and tries to identify the species, and of course the route and possible collisions, and that's when the command to stop a specific turbine comes. And we are testing that in one of our wind farms in Spain, and that it's not finished. And my colleagues from renewables are saying, "Oh, Emilio, please, it's still under development." But I think the prospects are good, and if it's not this system, it will be the next one. But things are coming, very powerful things that could be eventually should be applied offshore as well. But I mean, offshore is a different animal when compared to onshore in many aspects. So, but again, technology and innovation is crucial for understanding and providing the right mitigation actions here.
Thanks, Emilio. And I'm going to pick up on this point on the mitigation measures, because there is a lot of innovation in this area. There's also a lot of measures that are being tested in offshore wind farms where we maybe don't really know yet how effective they're going to be. I mean, we need to have the data to determine this. So I wanted to ask you, what's needed for, one, ensuring that where we have measures that are proven to be effective, that these are kind of applied across the board as like a standard. But also at the same time, how do we encourage further innovation, all this new technology, these different measures, so that we can keep improving on these mitigation measures. So yeah, just your thoughts on this, and maybe Renier, I come to you first.
Sure. So in terms of making sure that these proven effective measures are applied broadly, I will say that we're speaking in the context of Europe right now, but we as a company work in Asia Pacific, we work in the US, we work here, and there are different species, different regulatory regimes that have different ways of approaching this topic. And so it's a societal question. Are you looking for raising the bar across or having a sort of different set of standards across all these different markets that have very different ways of approaching this work? Or are you more outcome driven in terms of, are you trying to reach a certain percentage of mitigation or a certain larger conservation goal? And those things can work hand in hand. But I think we do also have a good communities like Ocean, which was mentioned in the video, for being able to elevate certain technologies, discuss and debate which are best applied, and using best available science and the resources coming out of testing those technologies. I think we need regulatory regimes that can think and adapt to things like artificial intelligence and new technologies that might be able to provide a mitigation benefit, but that have to go through a long evaluation process before they're sort of deemed worth using by a regulator, which tend to be relatively conservative in what they're willing to accept and bring into the permitting process. And so that's something where it's really helpful to have civil society engaged from the get-go on development of technologies to make sure that the right questions are being answered upfront in the data that you get as you test and develop a product. And as in terms of what we can do to encourage further innovation, I think there's a lot that the private sector that we as Ørsted, and I'm sure Iberdrola, are also doing to just in the course of making our business and operations more efficient, being able to deploy offshore wind at scale because we know the stakes of delaying further climate action. So there's action being taken internally. There are opportunities for R&D funding and testing, and you can do that through, in the case of the US, some tax credits, or you can do it through, again, tender criteria. But that's really particularly helpful for having a sandbox where you're trying to address one specific either environmental, social, technological challenge, and that needs to be stated up front. Sort of what is the goal of using a particular wind farm to understand a particular impact or question. I think those are some of the big buckets for me, but I'm excited to hear what Emilio has to say.
I would add to that a big driver for promoting more innovations in this aspect, it should come from the company itself. Both our companies, Ørsted and Iberdrola, we have both set up targets to become positive on biodiversity. If we honor that target, and we will, when you get into the economics of meeting that target, then you're going to have the economics and the practicalities. There are things you won't have a solution for today, so you have to innovate and get it. Others will drive you to innovate to reduce costs of those actions, and then you have the typical innovation ecosystem. You have to collaborate with research institutions and conservation agents and everything. Bring all together. I mean, thing with nature, it's probably longer lead times than other technologies. Because to test or to understand if a solution is delivering the expected outcomes takes sometimes years. So you have to start trying multiple things all together and in parallel, and then eventually you will understand if the solution was good or not. And also, we all here know that nature is an open system, so your solution might be doing something wonderful, but then something else is in there that you might not see, and that is preventing from experiencing the benefits of your solution. That is another challenge of nature, and understanding if a solution did work or not, because this is not an isolated system, so it's a challenge. Again.
Absolutely. And that's why, coming back to my previous point, I think having these systems being taken up across sectors, across the maritime sector, fisheries sector, that are all operating in the same, the military, for example, I think it's important that we start to make sure that we're sharing standards and process across all of those organizations.
Thank you. Very good points. I'm going to pass to a bit of a lighter question now. This is coming from an anonymous attendee, so I don't know who it is. But the question is, what is your favorite bird? Do you even have a favorite bird?
Seabird. I'll probably go for the albatross. I just think, not only are they incredibly precious, endangered, but they're just sort of like they're machines, right? They can cover these incredible distances, and they mate for life, which is very romantic. But I think the Gentoo penguin also is just an incredibly adorable little guy.
I would have problems trying to find the English name for what I would say. But I mean, anyway, eagles. I love eagles. They are fantastic, but they are not offshore. Anyway, I would answer that.
Thank you. I'm also a penguin fan. I'm worried because it's a bird that can't fly, so I don't know if it really counts.
I'm sure this is a big debate within bird life. What counts? If it can't fly, is it eligible for protection?
Okay, we're coming towards the end, so I have a final question for both of you. So cooperation is something that came up in the documentary. My colleague Anouk mentioned it at the beginning, and you've both mentioned it at various points, like how important this is. So the question is, in order for your organizations to deliver on your ambitions on nature, what would be like your top 2 asks from other organizations or stakeholders? What would be your big requests from them?
That's a great question. The top 2 asks for collaboration that enables delivery of success of our ambition. I think openness to being iterative, to adaptive management, to being able to come back and say, we're getting data, we need to adapt and change, and what are the options on the table, I think is a sort of fundamental philosophy that's incredibly helpful. And we need the resources and expertise that sits within NGOs and academia to be able to do this work and to do it credibly. Let's see, there was one other thing on my mind. I think there's also the willingness to join us on the journey of implementation also. So one of the great challenges that I think we see as we've been building out our pilot project portfolio is the offshore sector we have high standards for safety and worker safety and those sorts of protections. And they're not necessarily, while many offshore operations are taken very safely by NGOs that are working at sea, it's not the industrial scale. And so having willingness and time and capacity to be able to make sure that we're all operating offshore safely and doing that work in a way that raises the global bar for offshore safety operations is one other thing that I think has come up for us.
Thanks, Rennie. And to you, Emilia, the same question.
Yeah, I would say that collaboration is really high on the table just now. I mean, in the sector, I think I mentioned it earlier. We companies in this sector, we work together a lot. I mean, people might see us as competitors, and we are in some aspects, but we have no trouble sharing data and sharing outcomes, especially in areas that are not the most competitive part, which are, for example, nature protection, because that's an interest for the sector to be seen as a solution for both climate change and nature, and it's in the interest of everybody. So we are collaborating a lot. But I would add to what Rennie said, that all the actors should come to collaborating with an open mind and the search of solutions rather than barriers. I mean, we all understand challenges, so let's try and be together to find solutions, because we have to have offshore wind. But we have to do it right. We have to do it in compatibility with nature restoration and protection. So we all know the problems. So we need to find the solutions together.
Thank you, Emilia. And I think that's a great message to end on, because we've now reached the end of the event. So I want to close by thanking everyone for joining today and for submitting your questions. And a really big thank you to Rennie and Emilio for being here and providing such great answers to the questions. So I hope you all have a good rest of the day and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.